remember walking into my brother's wedding, trying to keep my head high despite the tight knot of anxiety in my stomach. The hall gleamed with crystal chandeliers, golden accents, and flowers that probably cost more than my entire apartment. Everyone looked so happy, laughing, clinking glasses. But I could feel the weight of my own insignificance pressing down like a physical force. I'd always been the quiet one, the financial idiot in my family's eyes. But hearing it spoken aloud in front of everyone was a shock that I couldn't have prepared for. My brother, beaming in his tailored suit, leaned into the microphone with a grin that made my stomach drop and said, "And of course we have my little brother here, still figuring out what to do with his finances." The laughter that followed cut through me like ice. I forced a tight smile, my cheeks burning, my hands trembling slightly, pretending it didn't wound me, but it did. Deep down, I felt a mix of embarrassment, rage, and disbelief, wondering how someone so close could demean me so openly. For a fleeting second, I imagined storming out, confronting him in front of everyone. But I didn't. I smiled and nodded, swallowed the humiliation, and promised myself silently that this moment would not define me. The humiliation lingered, a quiet ember that would eventually ignite into something far more powerful. But for now, all I could do was endure. I can't talk about that wedding without thinking back to all the years that led me there, the quiet grind that no one ever noticed. I grew up working part-time jobs while my brother got everything handed to him, from allowances to praise, as if success was his birthright. I stayed late at libraries, pored over textbooks, and sacrificed nights out with friends, just to make sure I could build a future worth something. Scholarships, internships, extra shifts, I did it all without complaint, silently proud of every small victory. Meanwhile, my brother never missed an opportunity to remind me that I was clueless with money, or too slow to get ahead. At family dinners, he'd flash that arrogant smile, showing off his latest gadget or bragging about investments he barely understood. I used to try to laugh it off, convincing myself it didn't matter. But every jab cut deeper than the last. It wasn't just about money. It was about respect, or rather, the absence of it. I learned to navigate life quietly, keeping my ambitions to myself, observing him take the spotlight, and promising that one day, the tables would turn. Those years of struggle, unnoticed by everyone but me, shaped every decision I would later make. Growing up, the family hierarchy was clear, even if no one admitted it aloud. My parents had favorites, and my brother always wore the crown. Birthdays, holidays, even casual praise, they all seemed reserved for him, while my efforts were glanced over or dismissed. I remember the time I worked overtime to cover a colleague so my father's company could meet a deadline, and the only acknowledgement I received was a distracted, "That's nice, dear." Meanwhile, my brother got lavish gifts for finishing a semester with a C, or for landing a minor promotion that barely mattered. At every gathering, he was celebrated, cheered, and photographed, while I shrank into the background, invisible and unremarkable. The resentment built slowly, a quiet hum under the surface of polite smiles and forced conversations. I began to notice the patterns, the favoritism, the excuses for his mistakes, the subtle undermining of my accomplishments. It wasn't just unfair, it was corrosive, shaping my self-worth around their approval that never came. And yet, each slight, each dismissal, planted seeds of determination in me, preparing me for a day when recognition and justice would finally be mine. I reached a point where silence felt less like dignity and more like self-erasure. After that wedding, something inside me shifted. The shame that had weighed me down turned into a quiet, burning resolve. I stopped imagining dramatic confrontations and began drafting plans in the margins of my notebooks. If they wouldn't see my worth, I would make it impossible for them to ignore me. I started reading company filings, learning financial reports, and teaching myself the language my brother used to brag. Late nights with spreadsheets replaced nights out. It was boring work, and it was mine. I practiced small, deliberate moves, reaching out to an old mentor, reconnecting with a former colleague who remembered my competence, quietly buying a few shares whenever I could afford it. Each tiny action felt like reclamation, a stitch sewing back a self I had been trained to doubt. My inner monologue hardened into strategy. Patience, timing, leverage. I imagined the day I would sit at the head of a boardroom table, not to humiliate him, but to speak in results while he could only speak in bravado. Fear sat beside that resolve. I worried about exposure, about becoming the monster my parents might paint, about tearing the fragile threads that still held our family together. I feared losing what little warmth I had left, but that fear was circled with a ring of clarity. Humiliation had given me a map. It showed where I had started, where I had been wounded, and where I could push back. I folded that map into my pocket like a talisman and checked it when doubt crept in. The plan was not mindless revenge. It was a careful reclamation of dignity and agency. I could not see the final move, not yet. All I could see were the steps ahead, quiet, precise, inexorable. Every calculated choice felt like planting a seed, and every seed felt like a promise that, one day, the harvest would be undeniable. I told myself to be patient, to act when the moment afforded maximum leverage, and to let competence do the humiliating work. I started small, almost invisibly, buying a few shares whenever I could, each one a quiet assertion that I belonged in the same world my brother flaunted. At first, no one noticed, which suited me perfectly. I attended industry mixers and seminars, asking questions, learning names, memorizing the hierarchy that would later bow to strategy. One evening, I met Clara, a former colleague who remembered my precision on a joint project years ago. Over coffee, I said casually, "I'm thinking about expanding my influence in the company. You've got connections. I could use guidance." She raised an eyebrow, intrigued but cautious, and I leaned in, lowering my voice. "Not for me. For the board. I want to make sure the right decisions get the attention they deserve." She laughed softly, the kind that signaled curiosity turning into alignment. "You've always been meticulous," she said. "I'll help, but you have to play it smart. Subtlety is your weapon." Subtlety became my mantra. I attended shareholder meetings, asking pointed questions about inefficient projects, highlighting overlooked opportunities, always framing them as concern for the company rather than personal ambition. Each suggestion earned nods from influential board members, my name creeping into conversations in ways my brother would never suspect. I began positioning allies in advisory roles, nurturing relationships with legal counsel and finance managers. Quietly, I suggested ideas that seemed small but shifted momentum in my favor. Every move was measured, designed to look like coincidence, but in reality, I was weaving a web of influence. The first real taste of power came when a proposed expansion, championed by my brother, was quietly voted down due to concerns I had subtly highlighted. I stayed silent, nodding politely, but the rush of satisfaction was undeniable. For the first time, I glimpsed what it felt like to have control, even if only partially, and a quiet thrill surged through me. This was no longer about patience or preparation. It was about proving, in small, precise increments, that I could rewrite the rules without a word of confrontation. The groundwork was laid, and though my brother remained oblivious, I knew the first seeds of reversal had already taken root. There were moments that made my heart pound, times when I thought everything might unravel before it even began. An unexpected phone call from a senior executive almost exposed my growing stake in the company, and I had to improvise, claiming it was part of a research project I was helping Clara with. At a charity gala, my brother's friend joked about insider moves, and for a moment, I thought someone might connect the dots. I smiled, laughed along, and let the tension roll off me, even as my chest tightened with fear. Despite my careful planning, obstacles cropped up constantly. Shares fluctuated, board decisions shifted unexpectedly, and every meeting carried the risk of a misstep that could ruin my strategy. I kept meticulous notes, cross-referenced every conversation, and double-checked every signature. The work was exhausting, mentally and emotionally, but I reminded myself that patience had to outweigh impulse. Meanwhile, my brother remained blissfully unaware, his arrogance undiminished. He boasted at family dinners about his brilliant financial instincts and laughed at my supposed failures, blind to the growing storm around him. Each careless word he spoke, each smug smile, only tightened the knot of anticipation inside me. I could feel the moment coming when all this careful maneuvering would converge. But until then, I had to remain invisible, silent, and ready. The suspense was unbearable and yet exhilarating. I was so close, and he had no idea. On the surface, my brother continued to shine. At dinners, parties, and company events, he laughed loudly, told jokes that landed perfectly, and accepted praise like it was his birthright. Everyone saw the confident, unstoppable man he wanted them to believe he was, and for a while it stung, watching him parade his success while I remained the quiet, invisible sibling, forced to smile and nod as if his arrogance didn't cut me to the bone. But behind the scenes, everything was shifting. Board members subtly sought my input. Executives ran ideas past me before presenting them, and my small, calculated moves began steering decisions in ways my brother would never suspect. Every email I sent, every question I posed at meetings, subtly rewrote the narrative of influence in the company. I relished it quietly, savoring the knowledge that he was unaware that the power he flaunted publicly was quietly slipping from his grasp. Jealousy mixed with anticipation, a tension that both tormented and energized me. Each public laugh of his became fuel. Each boast became motivation to keep climbing, to remain patient and invisible until the moment arrived. There was quiet satisfaction in knowing the first whispers of my authority were taking root, even if no one else but me realized it. The contrast was intoxicating. His world of visible superiority versus my invisible growing control, both moving toward an inevitable collision that I could hardly wait to see. I knew I couldn't do it alone. Quietly, I reached out to old friends who remembered my diligence, mentors who had once guided me, and legal advisors who understood the subtle levers of corporate power. Each conversation was careful, deliberate, testing loyalty and discretion. Over coffee, one advisor leaned forward, whispering, "If you play this right, you could control more than just the board. Timing and subtlety are everything." I nodded, feeling the weight of possibility press against me, my pulse quickening. I began planting seeds with sympathetic board members, casually offering insights that aligned with their concerns while framing my ideas as collective strategy rather than personal ambition. I met privately with a few, discussing company inefficiencies and long-term plans. They listened, nodded, and began seeing me as someone whose judgment mattered. Old colleagues once underestimated became trusted allies, quietly supporting my push for influence. Every interaction was a chess move. I prepped for the decisive board vote, carefully calculating timing, influence, and perception. Suspense hung over me like a storm cloud. One misstep could expose everything, yet every conversation strengthened my position. My brother, oblivious to the quiet shifts, continued to flaunt his superiority, unaware that the currents beneath the surface were about to sweep him away. The tension was electric, a quiet hum of anticipation that made every careful maneuver feel monumental. I felt the moment approaching when all my groundwork would converge, and for the first time, the possibility of public, undeniable authority felt within reach. The day I quietly blocked the expansion, my brother had been so sure would cement his dominance was one of the most exhilarating moments of my life. In the boardroom, I asked a few pointed questions, highlighting overlooked risks and financial inconsistencies that made the proposal appear reckless. Each objection was measured, factual, and seemingly impartial. But beneath the calm veneer, I was savoring the thrill of subtle revenge. Board members nodded, murmured agreement, and eventually, the motion was tabled indefinitely. I sat back, heart racing, while my brother fidgeted, brow furrowed, trying to figure out why his perfect plan had failed. His confidence wavered slightly, a flicker of doubt crossing his smug expression, though he said nothing aloud. The first crack in his armor had appeared, and I felt an electric surge of satisfaction I had long denied myself. Privately, I allowed myself a small smile, letting the quiet joy of vindication sink in. This was the taste of power, earned not with shouting or confrontation, but with patience, strategy, and careful manipulation. My brother, still unaware of the full extent of my moves, would soon realize that his world of superiority was subtly shifting beneath him. For the first time, the invisible sibling had proven influence could quietly, decisively, and irreversibly alter the balance. The day of the decisive board meeting arrived, and I felt a calm certainty settle over me, the kind that comes only after years of careful preparation. As the room filled with directors, executives, and a few curious family members, My brother strutted in, confident and oblivious, ready to dominate as he always had. I sat quietly at the table, reviewing notes, letting the tension build, savoring the moment before the storm. When he began presenting his latest proposal, outlining flashy acquisitions and grandiose expansions, I interrupted softly. Before we proceed, I'd like to clarify the current control structure of the board. Heads turned. His smile faltered. I continued. Effective today, the voting majority aligns with the interests of the company's long-term stability, which I now oversee. A stunned silence fell. My brother's eyes widened, lips parting as if searching for a reply. He sputtered, "Wait, how? That's impossible. This is my project." I leaned forward, calm but commanding. I followed due process, consulted with advisors, and ensured that decisions reflect prudent governance. Your proposal cannot move forward without board approval, which now rests firmly with me. Murmurs rippled through the room. Directors nodded, some avoiding my brother's gaze. His color drained as he realized the reality of the shift. "But I've built this. Everyone," his voice cracked, the arrogance gone. "Built it with risk and haste," I replied evenly. "But stewardship requires responsibility. The board and the company will move forward with sustainable growth, not impulsive ambition." He looked around helplessly, humiliation etched across his face. I could see the shock, the embarrassment, and the sudden awareness that control had slipped from his grasp entirely. The second power reversal was complete. The room had shifted. I was no longer invisible, no longer underestimated. Internally, I felt a surge of vindication, tempered by years of patience. Every calculated move, every quiet effort, had culminated in this moment. My brother, usually untouchable in arrogance, had been rendered powerless by strategy and foresight. The room's energy shifted, aligning with authority I had quietly earned. I concluded with measured calm. Decisions moving forward will prioritize the company, not personal pride. I trust the board agrees. Nods of agreement solidified my position. My brother slumped, speechless, a portrait of stunned humility, while I quietly savored the public and undeniable validation of years of restraint and planning. This was the turning point where patience, strategy, and subtle influence met their full emotional payoff, leaving him powerless, me vindicated, and the family dynamic irreversibly altered. After the board meeting, the shift in power was impossible to ignore. My brother's usual smug grin had vanished, replaced with forced politeness as he tried to navigate conversations that now carried a subtle edge of deference toward me. At company events, colleagues began consulting me first, seeking guidance I had quietly earned, while he floundered, fumbling through details he had once commanded effortlessly. Every question he answered was met with polite correction, every proposal countered with strategic insight that made his previous confidence look naive. The satisfaction was profound. It wasn't just the boardroom. I began noticing the small, symbolic victories. His seat at the head of the table subtly shifted when I entered. Guests turned to me for introductions, and even family gatherings carried a quiet acknowledgement that the hierarchy had changed. Each glance he cast my way carried a mix of disbelief, shame, and unspoken recognition. In private moments, I allowed myself to relish the full measure of emotional justice. The same brother who had mocked me in front of everyone, labeling me a financial idiot, now faced the reality of competence, patience, and strategic intelligence triumphing over arrogance. Karma, long delayed, had arrived. I felt no cruelty in my victory, only the satisfaction of recognition, vindication, and equilibrium restored. The humiliation was public but measured, symbolic yet deserved, and it marked a permanent shift in how the family and company perceived me. I had claimed my authority, demonstrated my capability, and finally, I was no longer invisible. Sitting alone in my office after the boardroom storm had settled, I let myself breathe for the first time in years. The journey had been long, exhausting, and at times painfully lonely. Yet, every sleepless night, every subtle maneuver, and every calculated risk had led me here. I felt a deep satisfaction, not just in the visible triumph over my brother, but in the growth I had achieved along the way. I had become someone my younger self could admire, patient, intelligent, and unshakably calm under pressure. there was also a bittersweet edge to it. Family gatherings would never be the same, and I knew some bridges might remain permanently burned. The same people who once overlooked me, who cheered my brother's every move, now looked at me differently, and not all of it felt comfortable. Still, I recognized the moral balance in what had transpired. I hadn't sought revenge for cruelty's sake. I had reclaimed what was always mine, proving competence and resilience outweighed arrogance and favoritism. I allowed myself a quiet smile, reflecting on how far I had come. The humiliation that once defined me had been transformed into strength, and the patience I had cultivated had yielded both power and dignity. In the end, I realized the victory wasn't just over my brother. It was over every doubt, every slight, and every moment I had once allowed to diminish me. I had achieved justice, not only in the world around me, but within myself. As I leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet hum of the office settle around me, I couldn't help but think about the path ahead. The battles that once consumed me now felt like lessons etched into my bones. My brother had been humbled, the company secure under my guidance, and yet the future remained wide open, full of possibilities I hadn't even imagined when I first began this journey. There was a thrill in knowing how invisible I had been, and how completely that perception had shifted. I allowed myself a small, private laugh, thinking about the looks on my family's faces, the subtle glances that acknowledged power where none had been expected. They had laughed, mocked, and dismissed me for so long, never realizing who they were dealing with. Now, every meeting, every decision, every glance carried the weight of my presence. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible authority, but it was undeniable. The satisfaction was profound, but it was tinged with anticipation. The journey had changed me, sharpened my instincts, and opened doors I hadn't dared hope for. I felt empowered, cautious, and ready, knowing that life would continue to test me, but now on terms I controlled. And in that control, in the knowledge that I had quietly rewritten the rules, I found an emotional resonance that no one, least of all my brother, could ever take away.